Thank you for so much for coming tonight to our third edition of the Jim Schartz Annual Lecture Series. Before we go too far, let me introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Deborah Polsky. I'm the Executive Director of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. And I want to thank those of you who are members for being here. We hope you consider this one of the benefits of your membership. And for those of you who are not yet members, we'd love to have you join us. And you can find us online at djhs.org or reach out to us at the office. There's some information on the back of the card. And the card is there not just to tell you about us, but to also tell you about this marvelous event that we do every 2 years, where we give the Ann Loeb Sikora Humanitarian Award to people who follow in her footsteps. And this year we're honoring 4 wonderful women, 2 sets of sisters, and the event is on May 2nd. It's I was going to say dinner and dancing, but it's not. It's dinner and cocktails. And we'd love to have you join us. And again, you can find that online or call us for more information, and you'll be getting invitations in the mail. So, with no further ado, let me tell you about the Jim Schartz Annual Lecture Series. Ongoing for well over 10 years, bringing in locally and nationally known speakers on subjects of interest to the Dallas Jewish community. Our annual lecture series has been designed to bring information and awareness of aspects of Jewish and Southern history, particularly Texas history, and culture. In 2019, we renamed our series to honor Jim Schartz of blessed memory, the 2012 to 2016 president of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. Jim's community interests were many, but he will be remembered most for his work with the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. A strong leader, Jim Schartz is remembered for the remarkable strides made at the Historical Society during his 4-year tenure as president, maintaining strong fiscal responsibility, offering meaningful and successful programs and fundraising events, and being instrumental in moving the organization forward in delivering full archival digitization. You can go online on our website and begin to see what we actually have in our archive. Best known for his warmth and his mentalkeit, as well as his dedication to the growth of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, we're thrilled to have this opportunity to honor him with this annual series of lectures. Our speaker tonight is Carmen Goldthwaite, a career journalist and syndicated investigative reporter who turned those skills into a spade to unearth stories of Texas women ranchers, lives, and tales little known or long forgotten. She's written about their stories in Texas Ranch Women, 3 Centuries of Metal and Moxie, and Texas Dames, Sassy and Savvy Women Throughout Lone Star History, which will be available for sale after she speaks tonight. She teaches creative writing, including narrative nonfiction at SMU, and serves as a director and vice president-elect of Archives of Women of the Southwest at the SMU DeGolyer Library, and as writer-in-residence at the TCU Bob Schieffer's College of Communication for Journalism. Hard to say. Drawing on years of experience, Carmen loves to pass on the tips and excitement to other writers as writer-in-residence at her alma mater. In SMU's creative writing program, in her home with small groups, and at conferences and seminars. The Fort Worth, Texas native is proud of her heritage as a 7th-generation Texas. As such, the author of these Texas women's stories has become popular on the Texas History Stone, telling these stories to the likes of Daughters of the Texas Republic, Westerners International, Daughters of the American Revolution, various women's clubs, and Colonial Sons and Daughters. She also speaks at museums and archives as well as UTA Library and the DeGolyer Library and Texas Women X's. We are proud to present to you Carmen Goldthwaite.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Deborah. I really appreciate that. I've looked forward to this for quite some time to get to talk with y'all. I have to tell you, when I walked in and saw the plethora of Jewish history on the table out there, I went, oh, I wish I'd known about that. My curiosity failed to connect me here in time to include those wonderful stories in some of my books. But what I do have for you tonight is a glimpse at 300 years of Texas history, kind of from coast to coast and border to border. We're going to romp through what it used to be like and what it might not have been like were it not for these women. They're women like an Indian maiden named Angelina. You may have seen her name on the Angelina National Forest, Angelina County, and the Angelina River, which started showing off on French sailors' maps in 1659. A Caddoan Indian. Think about what it would be like if she had not been in that Caddo village when French sailors washed up after a storm on the river that now carries her name. What would it have been like if they could not have talked to her people? What would it have been like if they could not have talked with the Spanish, with whom they warred a lot, but if they hadn't been able to speak, it might have been worse. She had a glib tongue for languages. The Hassini speech is tongue-clicking, so others find it difficult to make the sound, much less make sense with the sounds. But Angelina could take from her language and communicate with the French, communicate with the Spanish, and vice versa. That triumvirate of cultures then down in the Big Thicket area of Texas would not have been the same. She could not have told if she wasn't able to speak French, she could not have told the Frenchmen how to get through the thicket to New Orleans so they could get a ship back home. She could not have told the Spanish conquistadors, the governor that came with them, that they were no longer welcome here because their troops did not treat the Hassini women correctly. The Hassini women shared equal power with the men and in tribal councils, and the Spanish didn't respect that. So that being able to communicate the differences in cultures created a climate down there that produced quite a bit of change. Change beyond commerce, change beyond faith, became a nesting pot for migration from southern states that weren't, many of which weren't states yet, back in the early 1700s. So that's just one young woman and what she contributed. Her tribe gave the state its name because the way they greeted these strangers, these Europeans, was with the word teshas and tears. They had a tradition of tearing when they met a stranger. And it kind of scared these folks riding into Texas. But then they took the name the greeting Tejas made it Tejas, and we now call ourselves Texas. So out of that one little community, we have that kind of history beginning to unfold, that kind of template, if you'll use a modern term, of how cultures start coming together in this foreign land. Not foreign to Angelina and her folks, but foreign to those who are arriving. The moving on from Angelina and jumping ahead of 3/4 of a century was Patricia de Leon. She grew up on horseback riding Andalusia horses on her father's ranch in Mexico, the interior of Mexico. Loved horses and fell in love with this military lieutenant, this army lieutenant who had been, I think he'd been punished. He was sent to Tejas on patrol, and he fell in love with the grasslands of Texas, what often we will call the breadbasket of Texas, or the grass kingdom. Grass grew 4 to 6 feet high. And the wild horses that ran free were mixed with Mustang and Andalusia. He was a horseman, and he just had to go there. And so after they had married and had a baby, and they gathered together, and with a stream of over 100 two-wheeled wooden-wheeled carts, they crossed the Rio Grande heading north. They settled around the Nueces River. They were in 2 or 3 locations, and eventually their home location, where they came to be the leaders of a colony, is where we now call Victoria. It was the only Mexican colony. The De Leons had been loyal Spanish, maybe loyal Spanish folk. But when Mexico whooped the Spanish, they fell in line with Mexico, trying to get colonization rights. The Austin family, Stephen F. Austin's father, and he were trying to get colonization rights, and they did. The De Leons, native son and daughter of Mexico, could not. And so there was a bit of animus there. But they finally won out, and about 1821 were able to get a colonization grant, established Victoria as the center of that town with 41 colonists. They brought with them things that we enjoy today: chili, guitar, tortillas, corn tortillas specifically. Each country that has come into Texas has brought some of this richness in here that would be vastly different without. When I lived in Washington, D.C., and I came home for a visit, my first stop was Mexican food. I see some agreement there. Just don't want to be, the next stop is barbecue beef. They can pour it over there. She tended to the ranch while her husband Martin tended to the town building, the politics of colonization, the growth and strength of the colony, and the security of it. Because in this whole region of Texas, there were about 3,000 immigrants, non-Indians, surrounded by 250,000 Indians who didn't want them there. Not all were like Angelina's people. They had about 1,000 soldiers to patrol and protect this region that at the time ran from not quite out as far as Presidio, but close, north to the Red River and east. So it's a somewhat large territory. There were regions of Texas' oldest city out El Paso, but that didn't seem to have the Indian problem that the eastern region did. The town grew. They grew as a family in riches and wealth and sent their kids to Europe for school and education, and she and Martin traveled there. But then he got felled by malaria, and she was left in charge, not just of the ranch that she had been running, because she knew how to ride, to rope, to cut, to brand, to birth. She was in charge. Now, I'm not saying she did all those things, because she ended up having 12 kids. So she may have farmed out some responsibilities there. But what she did have is that sense of hospitality that we still enjoy today, and I'm grateful we do, and hope we never lose it. But there came a time when, after Martin was gone and she was in charge of it all, that the itch for a change of government needed scratching. The Mexicans were doing what others before them had done, and raised taxes. And that fed that itch for a different form of government, that desire to be free, that desire to be independent. And so she and her sons, who were of military age, went with the fight for independence. She was a gun runner. She wasn't just a passive sit at home and support the rebels. She bought guns in New Orleans, but she was quite wealthy. She stashed them on her ranch and then sneaked them into Goliad. So, but things did not turn out so well for her because she had a Spanish surname. And after the war, and Texas had won, Anglo-Texas had won, Anglo laws replaced your Spanish law. Women did not have the signature rights that they did have under Spanish law. And people wanted, with English names, whatever that means, wanted their land and got it. After a couple of her sons were killed, not in the war, but in the aftermath, she fled to New Orleans and back to Mexico. But then, after her grandchildren were grown, it was time for her to come home to her beloved Texas. And she did. And it was a mess, but she had meticulous, her diary is in the museum at Victoria, meticulous handwriting of her will, and who owed her what, including war reparations from the Republic and from the state of Texas, and which child got how much of which, if ever, were collected. It's a meticulous accounting, proportioned to her heirs. She, as well as so many of these women through the first half of the 19th century, their wills will have a line in them, something like this. And to my granddaughter, I bequeath my feather mattress. That must have been a prized possession, because this was such a pattern of inheritance for the young women. Patricia de Young settled into her home in town, and the ranch was gone, basically. She founded the Catholic church there, St. Mary's, that still exists, still use the gold chalice that she gave to them when she brought a priest in to serve the community. Women throughout the European immigration had two things they did when they reached Texas, because it was a wilderness area. It was a foreign land. They established education and religion, whatever the faith might be. Those were the two goals. Someone kind of like that was an Irish lass. Texas was her second country after she left Ireland. She was here 4 or 5 years before she was widowed. She had 2 sons. She had 5,000 plus acres to run and manage. She learned to ranch on horseback from her Mexican neighbors. They would gather horses in the wild horse gully that ran behind her land, and she and her sons would ride, rope, cut. All of that ranching activity trailed the cattle they collected, which were largely mission cattle that were roaming free, random, and take all of it to New Orleans or on the Tascasita Trail. Then she was a loyal Mexican colonist. She had been here since 1821. And she would not have changed except Stephen F. Austin did. When he signed the Declaration of Independence, her loyalty switched, her loyalty was with him. And so it went with him to the independent nation of Texas. She allowed her son to write courier for Sam Houston, the older boy. And when things were getting a little noisy with the cannon shot going off, she and the younger boy got in the wagon and boarded up the 2-room dog trot cabin they had, headed for the Sabine River for protection under the French and U.S. flag. When they reached the river, they started hearing huzzas and riders coming in. We've won, we've won. And so she turned around, went back to her cabin, parked her wagon, and stepped across the slain bodies of Mexican soldiers. The Battle of San Jacinto had been fought on in her front yard. And it was a mess. Fights for independence are messy, and it was for her, for so many. She couldn't get any help from the military. Sam Houston was stretched out underneath a big old tree down on her land, and story goes, she marched down the hill. Now this hill, if it had more than a 5-degree grade, I would buy Deborah's dinner. It's even considering 100, 200 years of erosion, it had to be something to be called a hill. But there he was, and she marched down there and said, I want you to get these damn dead Mexicans off my land. It was hot now. We moved into April, out of March cold. It was not pleasant. And he said, why, ma'am, you'll go down in history. She said, I don't want history. I'm a stock raiser. I need to get back to raising stock. My cattle can't feed. No help. When Santa Ana was captured, he didn't have his men clean it up, which you would have thought, but they didn't. So she, her sons, and her slaves, she had 2 slaves, cleaned up that mess so that her cattle could feed and she could plant for the fall crops and return to life as normal. She lived life as normal, which became for her the largest ranch in what is the area now called Harris County. She died in a house fire in 1854, believed to be retaliation. It seems as though, now she, like a lot of people who came to Texas in those early years, she couldn't read or write. if she got tax notices, she probably either didn't care or couldn't read them. The state, the republic, and then the state, one by one, claimed parcels of her land. She was left out of the 5,200 and some odd acres with about 50 acres around her cabin. That's what they said. But she was like a lot of Texas ranchers. When cash got short, sell a piece of land, she sold it. Not until they were making the part for where the battleship of the Republic, Battleship Texas is docked, did they realize, and that was in World War II, there wasn't clear title to much of that land. She sold it to people, and they sold it to people, and they willed it to people, and it wasn't hers to begin with anymore. So she had a bit of a silent revenge on the status quo there. But that's the kind, it took women of this ilk, as well as the gentler sort that would soon be coming in, to calm and tame this vile land that many of us love today. One of those who came in this time, she arrived in 1847 over here at Mountain Creek. And that was about 5 years before Peggy's death. She could read and write, cipher. Her husband could not. He hunted, fished. They ran a ferry on Mountain Creek. And as her son would say in later years, she kept the day book of what went on. She knew the business. And after they were there 4 or 5 years, they moved into Dallas, which had this stunning population of 250 in 1852. And so they got set. They started another ferry. That's what they'd been doing. So that's what they went back to doing. Then they built a wooden toll bridge. And then they built a brickyard. He would go out in the community, and she took care of the business. Everything from the day she arrived to the day she died took place at her kitchen table. Because she needed to be home to take care of the 5 kids. He was killed by the sheriff when he went to collect a debt from the sheriff. A lot of these women are widowed, and widowed fairly young. And they, by circumstance, have to step up and take charge. Both of my grandmothers had an expression for women like this, that they were full of giddy up and go. And I think it's a good expression for these gals who really had to rise to the occasion. But she, after he was killed, then she was in charge of the ferry, the bridge, the brickyard, the sawmill, hotels, 2, 1 brick, 1 frame. And she moved fairly profitably, growing that business, running her kids' lives, because she wanted them to never know that their father couldn't read or write. And it was imperative that they have an education. In 1860, she got hit with a couple of blows. It wasn't too long after he died, a year or 2. The hotel burned, and a flood took out the toll bridge. And then we were in the Civil War. So it was not till after the Civil War that she was able to rebuild. There were political forces trying to grab the bridge from her, the rights to the bridge, but other political forces sided with Sarah Cockrell. And that move was stopped, and she rebuilt a metal bridge at that point. She continued to build hotels, flour mills. As her kids grew and moved into the business, she moved out of those businesses and into real estate, all from keeping her day book in this kitchen. But one of the things that gave her most pride was winning the wine competition in 1870 at the State Fair. And the fact that she had a multi-burner stovetop. You kind of learn what a culture doesn't have when you learn about what they treasure. And that was what Sarah Cockrell treasured. She had a some might think perhaps she was a little mild, not too stern. She was pretty stern stuff. In the 34 years she was in business in Dallas, she was in court 37 times. And won most of them. Many of them were real estate people trying to move in on a widow and take what wasn't theirs, or what they thought wasn't theirs. So one fella said about her, let me find that quote because it is really rich. She is a woman who could always speak her mind, but never used too many words to do so. Huh? Isn't it? It seems like a woman who arrived in 1868, again after the Civil War, had she been able to read and write, might have taken a page out of Sarah Cockrell's daybook. She arrived as a laundress, a freed slave from the Carolinas, and she was doing the laundry for some of the bankers in this thriving metropolis now. And she got speaking to them and knowing them, and there was this piece of property she wanted so bad, tall trees, I guess it reminded her of Carolina, and rich soil, and she wanted to build a homestead there. And she was saving her pennies from these shirts that she would wash and iron, deliver. And one of the bankers said, well, I'll back you on that, and you just do my shirts. So she negotiated the price for this land at $50. That is now the corner of Elm and Irving. 20 years later, it was worth $25,000. In 1949, it was $250,000 value. She left it to her daughter and her son-in-law. She had long since kicked out her husband because he had come home and was beating on her pretty good several times. And it was because a fellow in town said, just go home and beat her until she agrees to sell. She said, I'm going to divorce him before he kills me. And she did. And he was out of the house and out of luck. All black jurors during Reconstruction, all white jurors during post-Reconstruction supported Hope Thompson's claims in these courts. She, too, had a swinging door in the Dallas County court system as people tried to grab her land because it was prime property then. The railroad was coming right by. Dallas was opening up. They had given credit to Sarah Cockrell. They called her the first woman capitalist in Texas, which is probably true. There may be a pine forest owner down out of Huntsville that's close to that. But Sarah Cockrell had that reputation, and Hope Thompson, while she didn't have that reputation, she was dealing with the black-white issue by this time, as we moved into the 80s. It wasn't an issue when she bought the land in 1868, which kind of surprised me. But Dallas hit a boomtown in the early 70s after Reconstruction, and a lot of folks were moving in, and a lot of land was being wanted, and the knives were out, so to speak. Her land was 2 blocks north of Commerce Street, 1 block north of Main, and a block south of what became Pacific. The TMP Railroad built into Dallas along that road in 1873. It was muddy, it was rutted. The wagons were coming from everywhere with cotton. It was the only cotton route. And that's because Sarah Cockrell's bridges, that she made the transportation over the Trinity River and put Dallas on the economic highway. So those are just some contributions these people have made. I lost my place on Hope Thompson. There was something I wanted to find there, and I think I missed pretty much got that. There was a rancher, and it's a woman. Now, as a writer, now Linda and I can relate to this. She financed her ranch by writing and selling short stories. Can you believe? She was getting $2,500 for her short stories in the 1860s. We wouldn't get it now. That was Lizzie Johnson at the time, later became Lizzie Johnson Williams. She was a teacher. Her daddy and mom had been teachers and had schools poking around the Austin area. And she seemed to be bored if she didn't have a lot of things to do. So she wrote stories in addition to teaching. And ranchers, she taught math and was highly skilled in math, so they got with her to do their bookkeeping. Not too different from Sarah's day book. Keep and count. And she did that, and she thought, this is better than teaching. And she bought land out of Austin, not far out of Austin. She bought cattle, and then after the Civil War and the trail drive started, she put her cattle on the trail. When she met and married a fella who was a kind of, I don't think they have it, but a defrocked Baptist minister. Defrocked because of some of his character traits or lack of. When she married Williams, she made him sign a prenuptial agreement that is recorded as the first prenuptial in Texas. And then he had his herds, she had hers. They road branded them, and they traveled north to Chicago with their herds, or maybe Kansas City, depending on where the market was best. They went. One hand said she would tell him to brand all of Hezekiah's calves with her brand when they were born on the trail. And he said Hezekiah would tell me to brand all of her calves with his brand. So he was busy branding calves one of the other. She was known to be the best judge of cattle, what to buy, what bulls to buy, how to grow her herd and the quality of it, and know when to sell before the bottom fell out of the market. And some of those decisions led them to Cuba and El Paso and back to Austin. But along the way, she she continued to write, and she continued to buy and sell cattle until she became too old and too ill. When Hezekiah died, he died in El Paso. They'd gone there for his health. She bought a coffin, and it cost her $600 to ship the body back to Austin. And she wrote across the wooden coffin, "I love the old buzzard this much." And sent him back. He was the glad hander and she was the recluse socially. So after he died, she pretty much was out of the mainstream. Prior to that, she had collected a sizzling array of diamonds because they'd go to New York after every trail ride. And she had tiaras and necklaces and diamonds. At that time, in the late 1870s, worth $10,000. So you can extrapolate what it might be. El Paso is an interesting town. We're hearing a lot about it today with the news that's afoot. I had a college suite mate who was from out there, and I got to know a little bit about the town and its environs from her. But it's the oldest Texas town. It's a town in the 1500s. Wasn't a province, it wasn't a colony, it was a city. Ciudad del Norte. And it drew people from odd places. People like Ernst Kohlberg. He came there from Germany in the mid-1870s. There was a wave of migration from Germany in that period. A lot of it came through Indianola to San Antonio, either to go out the Silver Trail through Presidio and south through Mexico, or to go north from San Antonio into the El Paso area. He established the first tobacco firm, cigar manufacturer in Texas. And with success at that, he went back to Germany after 10 years and married a young teenage Olga. She came to El Paso in 1884. She was a teenager, a teenage bride. She came with a way of living to introduce to El Paso and therefore to the rest of Texas that hopefully we still encounter today. She operated on the philosophy, what you learn in childhood will have a lasting effect on your life. That's what she said over and over again, as she advocated for early childhood education. As she and a half dozen other women in El Paso put together a private kindergarten for their children in 1885. But in, 1888. But then she said, all children need this, not just ours. They brought in a teacher, they purchased blackboards and books. So apparently she was a leader. She didn't try to do everything herself. She wasn't a control freak, but she invited people to come along and grab hold of her passion. And they did. She said, let's open this to all. And they went to en masse, the 5 or 6 women went to the public school system and said, here are the supplies. We will fund the teacher. We need to open teachers. We need to open this to all children because what you learn in childhood will have a lasting effect on your life. And so that became the first public kindergarten in Texas. El Paso. Yeah. that group of women that Olga Kohlberg led would go on to really touch the heart and lives of people in that region of the country. She went by the railroad station one day, and there was a fellow on the platform so sick he died. And they didn't have a hospital. And so that was the next project for this group of women. This group of women gradually evolved into the El Paso Women's Club. It went through several name changes on that process. They made the hospital in the house, in a house, and was providing medical treatment for people. Then they didn't have a library, and this young mother from Germany, they need books. So they created a library, and the city was only going to fund it minimally, and Olga and her colleagues said, we'll fund it and we'll provide the expertise. She told the librarian to buy the best books. She said, we'll take care of the cost. She had brought with her the sense of what any growing society needed: the culture, the art, medical treatment, education, this softer side of town. That's what drove her. Those passions, was having those passions, having a gift of leadership. That she wouldn't, the crown on all of this was the Cloudcroft Baby Sanatorium. That was so, she had lived through several droughts by 1911, and babies were dying from the heat. And so she got a doctor from North Carolina, and they established this sanatorium up in the mountains. And he would treat and tend these children until it was safe for them to go back to the city, down to the city. That doctor became her son-in-law, one of her son-in-law. So when the city wanted to build a park, they allocated $100, and August said, we will plant, dig, and weed. And the San Jacinto Plaza is now the garden spot in the city where they did that. After she had been here about 10 years, she and Ernst built a temple for the Mount Sinai congregation that they founded. In 1972, 37 years after her death in 1935, Olga was inducted into El Paso's Hall of Honor Award. Written about her at that time were these words. Those of us who knew her, whose life she touched, can vouch for her indomitable spirit, her dignity, her tolerance, her integrity, her calm, courageous manner, and her persistence in working for the best of the community. The writer of her obituary in 1935 penned these words: she graciously acceded to their wishes, there being whoever didn't agree with her, never harboring any ill feeling when the majority in the group voted against something she had sponsored. But he called her zealous. It had to be zealous to get things done in those days, if not today. These are just a quick look at some of the women, and one I haven't mentioned yet is Edith Theron Willman, one of Dallas' early women attorneys. She got her degree, and she had her passions of childhood education, of reforming child labor laws, of prison reform, of highways construction. And she realized she couldn't get anything done until women got the votes, so she became active in the suffragist movement, she moved into that. Then she ran for office and became the state's first woman legislator, representative, pushing bills to try to accomplish those goals. Some of them were defeated. The man she defeated for the office ran for Senate, won, and defeated her bills when they got to the Senate. She kept running for office. That was the only one she won, but so that she could keep the message going that this is what we need to be doing as a state. Modernizing education, streets, highways, reforming the prisons, being more compassionate with the insane. So she continued to carry the banner by running for office. Like I say, these are just a few of the women. It's hard for me to select which to leave out. At any time, it was hard to leave out ones for the books that I wrote. So I wrote 2 after 15 years of research. I thank y'all for having me here. If you have some questions, I would love to give it a go. Yeah?
Okay, so you did not say the full name of the Irish woman.
McCormick. Peggy McCormick. Margaret, quote, Peggy McCormick. Thank you. Yes?
Sarah's Cockrell, I think, also owned a lot of property.
Yes.
Isn't that right?
When her sons took over the other businesses, she moved into acquiring parcels of land. She had over 100 deeds to varying sizes of pieces of land.
I think the house that we are working on a documentary about, the Blue House, that was moved from its original location, was that property was originally, I think, owned by her and was later bought by Mr. Rosenfield, and where he built a series of houses, you know, really made it into a community, a suburb sort of. But I remember reading that she had owned a tremendous amount of property in downtown Dallas and the area that's the Cedars and wherever people were moving next. Were there any women who came without husbands? Were there women who came because they wanted an adventure or?
Yeah, the ones I've learned about, I wouldn't, most of them came out of necessity of some sort. Either folks at home didn't want them at home anymore, wherever home was, for various reasons. One woman came to Texas after she was widowed because she didn't, and that she was from Tennessee and she would have to live with her brother on his plantation. She didn't want to do that, so she brought her 4 kids and came to Parker County. So things like that. They came, but Sally Skull was a mule team driver here to make a living. The only one I know that came from that is Juana Pedraza out at Presidio. She had been widowed in Mexico. When she was 21, she moved and bought over 500,000 acres along the Rio Grande out there. She married, and all was well until Texas became a republic and adopted English law. All of her land became his with that legal change. Or her sons, which she managed pretty well.
Are women involved still at all in ranching today?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. One of my favorite women, I can't call her name right now, she's out at, one of my writing students is a rancher, and she is out of Jacksboro. And she's widowed and picked up the reins, you know, like so many did. This woman out in Alpine, she's a lawyer, she's county judge, and she's full and equal partner with her husband in a ranch that straddles the Rio Grande. So yeah, there are a lot of them. Surprised me when I started looking for Texas ranch women. I thought, am I going to have enough for a book? Well, many of them are holding on to ranches. Those who struck oil did really well, but many are holding on to family ranches through the century by working jobs in town.
How involved or uninvolved have women been in the King Ranch?
Well, Henrietta was Ms. King, and she brought in her son-in-law to help run things, but as her grandson said, the women in the family run this. And she had distinct rules of order about the King Ranch. Their story is, I loved getting to write it in the ranch book. She was definitely in charge of the ranch and anybody around it.
What about today?
It's still there, and it's still in litigation, and they still don't like writers to write about them. So, beyond public record, there's not a lot to write about, unless you could, they've sucked up as many of the public documents as they can. Wow. They've had tons of them. I would too if I were in their shape because of all the lawsuits.
I don't know if you know this, it's more of a statement than a question, but in doing some research when I do presentations for our society, the Austrian Historical Society, of course I only deal with Jewish people, but in figures that I've been looking and learning about, on the other end of the spectrum, with all the merchants coming to Texas, and specifically this area, the women were really, they were the driving force behind all of what we call the famous department stores, because a lot of the men, like Sanger and Harris and Neiman's and Cannes and this and that, were all traveling a lot, going to New York and other places to go on buying trips, and the women were running everything. So, and that's not a well-known fact. We always think of all the men that were, behind the names, but really it was the women behind the names. just so you know.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I wasn't aware of that specifically about those department stores, but that is a tradition in Texas. The women who ran the ranches while their husbands were out on patrol. They were the ones who had to roll cannons into their doorways to fire at Indians. So that tradition is pretty, I love to find when the connections between the generations. Thank you.
Any other questions? I want to thank you, Carmen, for talking to us tonight. I certainly heard a lot of things. My pleasure. Come back sometime.
All right.
Thank you all for coming, and there are a few cookies left. There are books for sale.
And I'll sign them if you'd like.
And we,